will give you a really good indication of exactly what F5 IngressLink is about and how will it benefit you. As you can see from my GitHub repo, I have these folders and these user guides. And this user guide is IngressLink. And we're specifically going to look at ClusterIP. Now, the goal of this user guide is so that you can clone this repo, you can use the components, and so that you won't have to redo everything that I've done. And so if we go ahead and take a look at ClusterIP, you'll notice all of the files that you need to reproduce or demonstrate what I'm going to show you today are here. From the BIG-IP's configuration using CIS, all of the Nginx ingress controller configuration is here. And of course, I'm using a demo app, which is an application called cafe.example.com or just example.com. And it has a couple of applications. So what is F5 IngressLink? Well, last week at Agility, which is F5's annual conference, we released our first initial MVP of IngressLink as part of the modern application delivery at scale or at large. And really what IngressLink is it is now development or cross-functional development between Nginx and BIG-IP, using both F5 CIS as well as Nginx Ingress services to provide, if you want to call it, the best of both worlds. So the Better Together story provides the functionality of using BIG-IP on the edge as your Kubernetes cluster load balancer plus additional services such as maybe TLS termination, whether you're doing edge or re-encrypt. Other services like maybe some HTTP header manipulation or TCP header manipulation using iRules, or advanced WAF, or other type of security services. And there's a lot more coming. There's a lot more features coming. Watch the space, including integration into DNS, including integration into IPAM systems, etc., etc. So this is true integration. There is cross-development between F5 BIG-IP and Nginx technologies. And so that's really what the F5 IngressLink story is around. It's really the collaboration of the different, if you want to call it, personas, the different groups that are interacting with BIG-IP, the different groups that are interacting with the Kubernetes clusters, and of course that other persona, the DevOps community, that is creating the Ingress resources themselves. As we take a look at this architectural diagram, you can see here that CIS is a separate manifest, it's a separate deployment, separate controller, as well as the Nginx kick instances, or if we're going to call it KIC for short. They are separate controllers and they are managed individually for now. What IngressLink is, it is communication across a common custom resource. We call it the IngressLink custom resource. And both CIS and Nginx Ingress controller are familiar with this resource definition, and they are communicating across the same API. So really important, IngressLink is really not necessarily user-defined. So when we talk about user-defined, it's not necessarily there to provide you a lot of configuration. It's really there to provide you simplicity. It's giving you that cloud-like experience that you would expect from integrating with a cloud provider. So if you are looking for lots of custom potential objects or specs in your CRD, then that's really something like Nginx potential configuration, or maybe it's a CIS CRD configuration. Maybe it's not necessarily IngressLink, because IngressLink keeps this completely simple. We want to try and hide or remove the complexity from the user as much as possible to keep the solution simple. So let's take a look at what we need to do. So when we configure CIS is really watching the nginx-ingress controller. CIS will actually probe or monitor, and it will check to make sure that the nginx-ingress controller is up and ready. There's a readiness probe, and we will monitor that readiness port. And so that means that now we know that BIG-IP is ready to handle and send all data plane traffic to Nginx KIC. And so CIS at this point will really just create an L4 forwarding or an L4 listener for some services for the Nginx ingress controller. And all of the application logic, all of the application routing, whether it's east-west or whether it's traffic that's serviced specifically for the coffee service or traffic that's serviced specific for the tea service, will come in through your BIG-IP. It'll hit the virtual here. BIG-IP would then forward it on to the Nginx ingress controller, which would then route it to one of those services based upon the specific path being either coffee or tea. We'll see that in the demo. What's also important in this environment is that I am using ClusterIP. That means that the BIG-IP can actually see the pods of KIC directly. BIG-IP is part of the Kubernetes Container Network Interface, or CNI. And in this instance, I am using something called Flannel. There are other CNIs out there. Calico is quite popular. So if you're using an overlay, then you can use something like ClusterIP. And so BIG-IP can automatically interact with the KIC pods and really go BIG-IP to pod. The advantage there is that we're bypassing any kube proxy that is sitting on the node. So a couple of things that's really important in this demo. The first thing is that we need to configure the CIS deployment. Then we need to configure the Nginx deployment. And then, of course, configure the application pods. And then, of course, we can go ahead and try that logic. This user guide is pretty much going to guide you through that entire process. So you can see I have some matrix here on some of the components that you need. You do notice that this is really an Nginx Plus feature requirement. In this example, I'm using OSS. However, it's highly required or recommended to communicate with your Nginx colleagues to get the correct release for the Nginx Plus version of KIC. I am using AS3 build 25, also CIS 2.4, which has now been released. And as you can see, one thing that I do first is I use Proxy Protocol. Proxy Protocol is so that we can provide information about the client's IP address to KIC so that it can keep track of the information. So that's already configured on the BIG-IP. I've created the IRUL for you. You can get the IRUL at the repo. The CIS configuration, I've provided a very simple way of configuring CIS. You could literally just cut and paste these commands. One thing that's really important is that you need the schemas for both CIS IngressLink CRD schema, as well as you also need the schemas for the CRDs on the Nginx piece. But the documentation has it all. You can see there is the schema. And as we go through, there's a couple things that you need. In this case, because I'm using ClusterIP, you have to configure the Flannel, which is the VXLAN profile, and that sets up the VXLAN tunnel. That's already that I have already done, and it's already configured. Then what I'm doing is I'm creating the CIS deployment. That's the CIS controller. Because I'm using Flannel, I have to create a dummy node. That's just part of Kubernetes. I'll create that as well, and then you can see your instance. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm accessing my Kubernetes cluster. I'll go ahead and take a look at the files. When you when you pull in my repo, you're going to get access to all these files. So you can see there's the schema, there's the CIS deployment, and of course there's the CRD resource. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to do a kubectl. I'm going to go ahead and create all the files for the CIS deployment. At that point, that's going to now go and create my two files. I can actually switch over to the API, and you can see there that the CIS instance is actually running. There's no communication at this point. There's no CRD, but CIS has started and is running in this environment. I can see that by doing a kubectl get pod -n, which is the namespace. And you can see there is my CIS instance. And I am logging the API on that separate screen. Okay, so once I've now started CIS, let's go and take a look at all my files. Again, you have all these files. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're actually going to configure all of the Nginx pieces that we need. There's a couple ways that you can do this. I find it best just to go and run this little file that I have, which creates all the little pieces. So there's a couple of pieces that I need to create. I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but if you want to get more information about these files, it's highly recommended to talk to your Nginx colleagues. We're going to go into the directory, and at this point, I'm going to create all of the Nginx components that I need. I've created everything for you, and you can review these files, and I'll review some of these files. So now at this point, I've created the Nginx piece, and we can actually see this. Let's get the pod. We'll get this on -n, and this is nginx-ingress. And as you can see, I've created 4 instances. So I've created 4 instances of KIC, 1 extra instance than my diagram. So if I go back to my diagram, I now have CIS is up. I have the Nginx components up. I'm going to go create the application components at this point. And to do that, I'm going to take a look at my components here, and I want to go ahead and do a kubectl create -f, and that is the ingress services. And so what I've done now is, as a Kubernetes administrator for the applications, I've actually created these pods. These pods are created, and I should be able to see that by kubectl get pods. And so in this instance, I have 2 coffee pods and 3 tea pods. And so those are actually running, and that's a separate. And so that's what's really important. As you can see, the different personas. So potentially the Kubernetes administrator would create the Nginx ingress controller. Maybe the DevOps user would create the coffee and tea pods, and maybe somewhat of a cross user that has some access to BIG-IP but some access to Kubernetes would create the CIS pod. And so that's one of the reasons why maybe the 3 different personas would kind of come into play here and create the 3 different items that I've created. So if we take a look at BIG-IP right now, do we have a virtual on the BIG-IP? Let's go change to the tenant. And the answer is no. And the reason why is because we haven't created the resource definition but that ties this together. So what the resource definition would do, which is basically a CRD, once we create this, it is aware of the endpoints. It's aware of the endpoints because CIS is watching the service, right? And those inside that service, those service endpoints, we know exactly what those endpoints are. So once we create the CRD, then you will automatically see the API request, which will then plumb and configure BIG-IP with that virtual address. And so let's go ahead and configure that. So we'll change directory to CIS, we'll change directory to CRD resource. And as you can see, there is the IngressLink CRD. So let's take a look at what that CRD looks like and how complex or simple that CRD is. And so I'm just changing to the directory structure where that is. Now what you can see there, that CRD is really 12 lines. I can guarantee you that over the up-and-coming releases of CIS, we're going to simplify this even more. We're going to potentially remove the virtual IP address and allow you to use IPAM or allow you to use type load balancer if you want to use it. So IPAM and type load balancer is coming in CIS potentially 2.5, maybe it's potentially 2.6. We'll get there when we get to sprint planning in a couple of weeks. But as you can see, we're monitoring this backend app. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create this resource. ctl create -f. And if my demo is right, we should see an API request on BIG-IP, and there we see it right there. So this is the API between CIS and the BIG-IP that communicates with BIG-IP and declares the configuration to BIG-IP, and that's what we've seen. We've seen it right there. So where is that communication? Let me go back to the diagram. So what we just saw there is the API request from CIS. And so CIS is watching the Kubernetes API. As soon as that IngressLink virtual server CRD was created, you automatically saw the API request that plumbed BIG-IP. And that's the API request right there. We did a post to the BIG-IP itself, and you can see there's the tenant, and you can see there's the response. We're using an AS3-based API. AS3 is our API between CIS and the BIG-IP. That's how we communicate with the BIG-IP. So at this point, we can probably see I can do a kubectl get vs, and you can get CRD vs. We should be able to see that. Okay, I probably got to use another name there, but let's take a look on BIG-IP at this point. Let's see our configuration. There you go. Oh, I didn't notice, but we have both port 80 and port 443 services. That's interesting. What's also interesting is let's take a look at our pool members. Now, if you remember, we deployed 4 kick instances. And as you can see, there's the 4 right there. And I can always pull their addresses if I describe them to see what they are. But I can take a look at the pool members right here, and I can see that we have 4 pool members. And if I look at my pool members right here, I can see all of the pool members. So you'll notice that 10.244.1.93, these are the pool members of the kick instances themselves. And because we're using ClusterIP, that's what's providing us the pool members. Now, let me ask you, how is it that these pool members are showing a green icon? And anybody that is familiar with BIG-IP, you'll know that a green icon is actually showing that there's a health monitor, as you can see right there. And the health monitor is actually monitoring the pool member. In this case, BIG-IP is monitoring the KIC pod. And what's really interesting is that we didn't see that in the virtual server configuration. So if we go ahead and take a look back at the BIG-IP, at the CIS resource definition, you'll notice that we don't see monitors here. Normally we would see monitors down here. And the reason for that is that because, remember when I talked about that cross-development between CIS and Nginx, we're hiding some of the configuration that we can take care of in code instead of having the user worry about this. So we know that we need to probe the nginx-ingress readiness port, which is what I'm going to show you right here. So we can actually probe this readiness port on port 881, which is exactly what we do. So we've pre-coded this into F5 IngressLink to simplify the input configuration. So the whole goal here is to abstract complex configurations and simplify the integration of F5 BIG-IP and Nginx KIC within the Kubernetes cluster. And that's what you see there. So the question is, let's go ahead and hit this virtual IP. And so as you can see right here, it's 10.192.75.100, but really what's really important here is that everything's based on the host name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create cafe.example.com and /t. And as you can see, I am hitting 10.241.193 and I'm refreshing it. So I'm going to the same server, but as you can see, my source port is incremented. This is my public IP address, which is coming from the big IP. And so as you can see, I am going to the first one of those nodes, 1.93, one of the nodes I'm going to. And if I open another one and go to example, this time we're going to go to coffee. And as you can see, I'm going to one of those pulls. We are using session persistence. I'm coming from the same browser. That's one of the reasons why. So that's pretty interesting. Let's replica or autoscale some of the kick pods themselves. Right now we have 4. Let's go ahead and change that replica. I have a very simple replica command here. I'm going to go ahead and run this replica command, and I'm going to change this from 3 to 1 or to 2. But this is something that you can easily manipulate. So right now, my current replica set is 4. I'm going to drop it down to 3, which is exactly what my demo is. And so that's currently 4. There we go. I've changed the replica. You'll notice the API call. You'll see the API call right away. There's the success on the API call. So I know right away that my big IP has been updated if I refresh this. I will see that I have 3. And I still have traffic is fine. Traffic continues at this point, so there's no disruption or interruption of traffic. And go back to the virtual server. I can click on a network map, which is really kind of cool because it kind of shows me the difference between the two. So let's recap. Back to the diagram. So the demo today that we covered was IngressLink using ClusterIP. And what we did was we configured the CIS deployment, we configured the Nginx kick deployments and all of the sequential configurations that it needs. Then we went and created the cafe specific services for both coffee and tea with their ingress configuration so that they could be load balanced with the cafe ingress resource. We created that. And then what we did was we created the ingress resource CRD, which plumbed the big IP, which allowed us to create the 2 virtuals on the big IP. So now all L4 traffic or all TCP traffic for that specific domain name, cafe.example.com, is coming through the big IP to the kick pods and then getting routed between the 2 different services. CIS is monitoring the kick pods to make sure that they're always up. If any of those kick pods go down, CIS will pull that kick pod from the pool members, and so there won't be any disruption at that point. And so that's the demo that we saw. I highly recommend, if you would like to test this in the lab, to pull and to clone my repo and to follow the guides on how to configure this process step by step. If you need any help, you can reach out to me. You can open an issue, or you can call our support help or contact your sales group. Thank you very much. Hope you have a lovely day.